We monitor these things for a reason. The other thing is this fee issue. For the first time, we began imposing some fees about a year and a half ago. The fee structures that we've set are smack dab in the middle nationally of the fees that are imposed by any of the other states on non-public providers, and we don't find them, frankly, unreasonable, contrary to the report. But with that, let me just stop with some good news. How do I do this? There we go. I'm going to fly through this thing because it's toward the end.
Right in front of you, Bob.
Oh, there it is, yeah. Okay. Apologize for this, but we'll get to the finish. When we were completing the work on our new strategic agenda, which the Council adopted a little over a year ago, called Stronger by Degrees, we called on the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, NCHEMS is the acronym. They're located out in Colorado to help us. And what we asked them to do was to take a look at where our campuses were in terms of graduation rates, the state attainment levels, et cetera, and to tell us what kind of trajectory of improvement we needed to be on in order to meet the goals that Governor Patton set in 1997 for the year 2020. And then we used that analysis to then set specific targets for improvement for each of the campuses. In the middle of all of that, the people at NCHEMS called us and they said, by the way, we stumbled across some information that you might not know but we thought you'd be interested in, and it's contained on this graphic. And essentially what this does is it shows us that during the decade of the 2000s, from 2000 to essentially 2010, Kentucky improved more than any other state in the country on a number of these categories. And if you read this across, you can see that for the first one there, for attainment levels of adults aged 25 to 64, we had a 74% improvement, which had Kentucky ranking #1 among the states in that category. And we moved, because of that improvement, from ranking 47th in the country to 45th. You'd hope it could be more, but you see movement because other states are trying to improve at the same time we are is not all that easy. For adults aged 25 to 44, we ranked 2nd in the country and moved from 44 to 36th. Now the difference there, because of the age groups, is the older adults, the likelihood you're going to improve the attainment levels of people in their 50s and 60s is obviously less likely than younger adults, and you see the improvement that we've made there. In terms of graduation rates from our four-year institutions, we rank #1. In terms of improvement in our graduation rates from our two-year institutions, we rank 3rd. In terms of total credentials produced, we rank 5th, but that was only because that was absolute numbers, not percentages, and the 4 states ahead of us are significantly larger states. And then last, in terms of awarding undergraduate credentials per 1,000 people in the population and the age group they identify, we ranked 1st there. There was no other state in the country that made more progress during the decade of the 2000s than Kentucky. And that's largely, in my judgment, not a reflection of anything I've done, but a reflection of the good judgment that Paul Patton had to put in place the legislation and the policy structures that are driving that improvement. So while we've still got a long way to go, I think there is a great deal to take pride in. The last thing I wanted to show you is this. This really grows out of your leaky bucket study that was developed last year and refined in this past session. In 1999, the share of the state budget that went to K-12 is that big blue chunk. The red chunk at the bottom is the proportion that went to post-secondary education. And then the other parts are Medicaid, corrections, essentially, law enforcement, and then the rest of state government. If you come forward to the budget that was just adopted, you can see that the share of the state budget going to both K-12 and to post-secondary has declined quite significantly against a $10 billion base, and that the shares of Medicaid and corrections are continuing to grow. What's significant about that, in my judgment, and I made this observation to the legislature in the spring, is that both Medicaid and corrections are largely expressions and symptoms of poverty. And while we have to fund and address those issues, the cure for those things we are defunding, which as a matter of public policy and strategy makes very little sense to me. Thank you for that. Just to give you a comparison, if we had simply retained the share of state funding that we had a decade ago, higher education would be receiving $230 million additional dollars of state support. And if we had retained the same per student expenditure for full-time equivalent student. Now remember, what these charts don't show you is the growth in enrollment. Okay, so we're absorbing significantly more enrollment for fewer dollars. Our share of the state budget would have been $734 million more dollars. When we talk about efficiency, our campuses are producing many, many more credentials, serving many, many more students, and doing it at a much lower level of state support. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bob, very much. Governor Patton.
Well, I would agree with Bob. The results of the report are certainly disappointing, not surprising. We do not have an educational establishment that educates our population at even the average of the United States. That's the cold, hard facts. If you were to have compared this to 15 years ago, it does, as Bob says, we've had remarkable improvement. There are a few things that I do disagree with the report on, particularly the openness that Bob talked about. We have a very lucrative, very strong state support for directly in the hands of the students through scholarships. And therefore, we become attractive to people from outside the state that don't live up to our standards to come in and take advantage of that. And the council has been very, very accurate in trying to make sure we're not a diploma mill. So where they gave us an F, I would give us an A. But other than that, generally, we've got some problems about education. If you go back 15 years ago, we were in the bottom 5, if not the bottom 2, in post-secondary education. And as the NCHEM's report shows, we're making progress, but we aren't there yet. So by putting the scholarship money in the hands of the students, it makes us more competitive, and it benefits private institutions such as the University of Pikeville and about 20 institutions like that scattered around the state. In fact, I don't think many of those institutions could survive without the fact that the students do have a substantial amount of money in their hands, and they make the decisions, the market decisions about where can they best be better served. And I think that's a good competitive, I think the independent institutions offer a good competitive alternative that keeps the public institutions more efficient and more responsive. And I think the public institutions have done a tremendous job, as Bob said, with relatively diminishing resources, and yet they have still kept the commitment to try to make affordable education available to all of the citizens of Kentucky. Bob referred to House Bill 1, which is the Kentucky Postsecondary Improvement Act of 1997, and back then, I don't know exactly where we were, but we were at the bottom of the bachelor degree attainment level for high school graduates. The goal was to reach the national average by 2020. We're not there because of the economic crisis. I don't think we'll get there, but the last time I looked at the data, if you want to project the rate of improvement that we've made over the last 10 or so years, theoretically, we would get there by about 2024, 2025. If we can do that, we will have made substantial progress. So I think that it is very, very, very important that this organization continue your commitment to education and these public policy discussions to keep our political leaders realizing that these are important subjects. The most important public policy decision made in my lifetime in Kentucky is the Kentucky Education Reform Act of 1990. And that was led by the business establishment of Kentucky that said we have to have a better educated population, and it's going to cost more money, and we're willing to pay for it. And we're willing to support an increase in the state corporate tax rate. And we're willing to support an increase in the sales tax rate. And we're willing to remove the federal deduction of federal income tax. The largest broad-based, across-the-board tax increase in Kentucky's history, strongly supported by a business community that realized that they had to have a more highly educated population, and they realized it was going to cost, and they realized that they were going to have to pay a part of the burden. Now, I do believe the second most important public policy decision we made was the 1997 House Bill 1, Higher Education Improvement Act. And it was a logical building on the foundation of improved elementary and secondary schools. And folks, our elementary and secondary schools are markedly improved. In many cases, we are approaching the national average at the elementary, particularly at the elementary level, and in many ways at the secondary level. But education is a slow process. As somebody once observed, it's sort of like watching a tree grow. From year to year, you can't tell much difference. But look like back 10 years and say, boy, that tree really grew a lot. And that's the way you have to look at education. It's like turning a battleship or an aircraft carrier. But this organization has driven that change. In 97, when we were debating House Bill 1, I had practically everybody in the state on my side except one institution based in Lexington, and we almost lost. We had the chamber, we had the Pritchard Committee, we had the other universities, we had the people that had studied the subject, and yet it was a very difficult political decision. And folks, anything that we do that's going to be important is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to figure out what it is, and since it's going to change things, it's going to be difficult to get people to adopt. If it were easy and obvious, it would have already been done. And so any major change, and one would hope it would be a change for the better, is going to require the leadership in Kentucky of the business establishment to push the legislature to make the changes. No major public policy decision will be made in Kentucky that is not supported by the business interest in Kentucky. Regardless of what you may say, we're a very business-sensitive state. And I'm proud to be known, I think in Kentucky, and I think nationally, as an education governor. But I really was a jobs governor. Check my campaign. Check what I said all through my public life. It is giving Kentuckians a better opportunity to have a job. But job governors morph into education governors. Martha Lane Collins, I think, was on your program yesterday. A jobs governor, but led some of the most important changes in our elementary and secondary education system prior to the CARA. And then Wallace Wilkinson, a jobs governor, and led the state or worked with the state and the legislature in the most fundamental change with CARA. And I also consider myself to be a jobs governor. And it's very important that we have intellectual capital. This group represents capitalists. I would say most of you consider yourself a capitalist. If you were a capitalist as old as I am, you would think about physical capital. You would think about factories and coal mines and machinery and the things, the kind of capital that you generate on Wall Street with or at a bank, or borrow the money, or float a bond issue. The capital of the future is intellectual capital, and you don't get that on Wall Street. You build intellectual capital in the classrooms of our schools and our colleges and our universities, and that takes a tremendous amount of public involvement. Henry Ford was a great capitalist, had a lot of factories and mines and timber operations, and we built a great industrial society with physical capital. Did you know Bill Gates doesn't really have that? Bill Gates' fortune, and virtually every fortune that we know about in America today, modern fortune, was based on intellectual capital. And that is the reason that, as important as education has always been, in the future it is going to be much more important, and folks, we're falling behind as a nation. And so we have to, as business people interested in the future of our society, we have to figure out how do we continue to maintain an edge on intellectual capital. The prosperity of America over the last 60 years has been based on the investments we made in education after World War II. Things like the GI Bill. GI Bill may be the greatest investment that the United States ever made. We built that intellectual capital that led to that prosperity in the latter half of the 19th century. So how are we going to continue to do that? Our universities are still the best universities in the world, but other countries are catching up. And we can't be too upset about them catching up to our level, but what we cannot allow to happen is them to exceed our level. And unless public policy makers understand the importance of education, one, and the partnership that it requires between the public and the private sector to make it work, then we as a country have some serious problems. So that's enough of that sermon. But getting back to Kentucky, we're making progress. We need the business community's help to make more. And all in all, I'm optimistic. Let me say that the report, it is important that we compare ourselves to other states. One of the great assets of the United States is the fact that we have competition between states. There is so much of our government structure and our public policy decisions are made on a state-by-state level as compared to other industrial societies. And so that competition generates efficiency. There was a book published several years ago, The Laboratories of Democracy, and it was the states. So comparing ourselves to states is very important. But knowing about the details of our state establishment is also important, and the Council on Postsecondary Education is the institution that is providing us, you, our policymakers, with that information. And I think that they do an outstanding job. One of the fundamental elements of House Bill 1 was that to establish benchmarks, measurable benchmarks, to see if we are making progress on that goal of being equal to the state average in the production of current production of education. Some people have misunderstood that to say that our goal was to equal the national average in the number of bachelor degrees by 2020. We can't correct the neglect of 100 years in 10 years. or 20 years. It was to raise the production of bachelor degree and associate degree and the general educational capital of the current generation up to the national average. That is the goal of House Bill 1. And we had established measures. And then every 5 years, we were to re-examine those benchmarks. And frankly, that part of the House Bill 1 didn't really get moving along well enough until Bob King got here 5 years or so ago. But this report that he just mentioned is a great indication of how we are doing, and so the council is our organization to tell us where we are, and do it in a way that our public policy molders, you, need to know in order to move ourselves forward.
Thank you. Let's give the panelists a round of applause. And now we're going to have time for some questions. So as you've listened to Alice and Bob and Governor Patton speak, I'm sure some questions have popped into your mind. One that popped into mind from some of the things that Dominic said is relating to the business community, what we can do to make the degrees that our students are going for more relevant to the business community. In other words, how can we make sure that the value proposition that they're investing in for their education will match what the business community needs for their talents and so forth. So, Alice, I'll start with you.
That's a really good question, and from my opening comments, that is an issue that the business community needs to come together and solve. In every forum I've been to, institutions are asking, what do you want? What is it? What is the product that you want? Is it, as I said, utilitarian? Analyzing the current jobs that are open, the skill sets that are available, and that's where the workforce and the educational community and the prediction of what's going to be available in the future becomes critical to both the student, the institution, and the workforce. It's not an easy thing, because if we ask this body, there would be specific skills, but there would also be the ability to think critically, to work in teams, to innovate. So what we want is somebody who is really trained to do what we want, because we don't have a lot of money to train them to do specific jobs, but we also want the creative ability to learn and to incorporate information.
I would add a couple, I guess, thoughts to that. First, I was struck by the graph that Ted Abernathy showed us in his presentation about the skill sets of people in the service sector, and how 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I don't remember the specific labels on his graph, but the need for critical thinking, for problem solving, for these higher level cognitive skills are continuing to grow. And so I think, we have this, we have an array of needs that range from folks that are coming out of KCTCS, largely, many of whom with certificates, who are going to be our welders and plumbers and electricians. And those skills are what they are. They're important and need to be trained appropriately. But as you move up I guess the pecking order of degrees into bachelor's and master's and professional and PhDs, I think there needs to be a greater amount of dialogue between the business community and higher education. I'm delighted by the fact that the Chamber is or is about to set up some sort of a working group for K-12, and I would suggest that we ought to have a similar type of relationship with some representatives of the business community with higher ed, so that we can be more confident that we are meeting your needs. The other thing I would say is Dominic talked about, under some of the innovation ideas that the U.S. Chamber was encouraging, was creating more practical experience for our students while they're earning their undergraduate degrees. Creating internships where our students can come out and actually apply what they're learning in the classroom or see how it's being applied in the workplace is a very valuable aspect of undergraduate education. I think it also provides to employers an opportunity to take a look at prospective employees. And you might find out of those interns that there's more than just a couple who are the people that you're going to want to hire when they complete their degree. So I think building these relationships would help as well.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think the market of supply and demand is a good driver to determine what levels of education are produced, providing the consumers have the knowledge. So I think it's very important that we somehow or the other, either through the council or the chamber or somebody, these students need to know what the market is, where the demand is, so they can make their free choices to combine their interest with their economic opportunities. And a lot of students go into college in particular with an idea of what they want to do and not much idea of how they're going to make a living doing it. And to the cringe of a lot of people in higher education, for all practical purposes, higher education today is vocational education. That's a real dirty word in a lot of people's minds. But the fact of the matter is today, most people go to college to better prepare themselves to make a living. There is more to the college than that. Certainly, getting specific skills is a very, very important part of higher education. But as Bob alluded, when you get into the higher levels of education, it's the development of intellectual curiosity, the development of higher problem solving that is more than just the accumulation of facts. So I think if we make sure that students have information on which they can make a better informed judgment, the system will work pretty well.
Paul, let me add one thing, another aspect of why this is so critical. We haven't talked today much about financial aid and the debt that is amassing for students in higher education, but student loan debt is approximating the $1 trillion level. And if we're not very careful, it will be, in my opinion, the next mortgage crisis, or potentially could be. Combination of debt, unemployed workforce is a formula for disaster at a time when we need to be investing in educational attainment. It's a toxic mix, potentially.